The mist rolled thick through Harlan County that November morning in 1987, clinging to the hollows like a shroud over secrets too dark to speak aloud. In a weathered cabin perched on the edge of Blackwater Ridge, Martha Hollow woke to the sound of her sons arguing in the kitchen below, their voices carrying that edge she had learned to fear over the past 3 years. She was 52 years old, a widow of 5 years, and the mother of 3 grown men who had never left home, never married, never found their way beyond the shadow of the mountains that had raised them. The Hollow brothers were known throughout the county as strange, isolated, and fiercely protective of their land and their mother. But no one in the small community of Pineville could have imagined what was festering behind the rotting wooden walls of that cabin. Martha had been a schoolteacher once, beloved by her students, respected in the church, a woman who sang hymns while baking bread and kept wildflowers on her kitchen table even in the hardest times. But after her husband died in a mining accident, crushed beneath a collapsed shaft that the company never properly investigated, something shifted in the household. Her eldest son, Jacob, took over as the man of the house with an authority that felt less like protection and more like possession. He was 34, broad-shouldered and silent, with eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. His brothers, Caleb and Ezra, followed his lead in everything, moving through the world like extensions of his will. The morning Martha woke to their arguing, she felt the familiar knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She had tried to leave twice before, packing a small bag in the dead of night and making it as far as the county road before one of them found her and brought her back. They never hurt her physically, not in ways that left marks anyone could see, but they had taken her car keys, disconnected the phone line, and made it clear that she belonged to them now, that the family stayed together no matter what. The isolation had become total. Friends stopped visiting after being turned away at the door. The pastor who came to check on her was told she was ill and needed rest. Slowly, methodically, the brothers had cut every thread that connected Martha to the outside world. What happened next began not with violence, but with a conversation that Jacob initiated one cold evening in late November. He sat Martha down at the kitchen table, Caleb and Ezra flanking her on either side, and explained in his flat, emotionless voice that the family needed to stay pure, that outsiders could not be trusted, and that certain sacrifices had to be made to preserve what their father had built. Martha did not understand at first, her mind refusing to grasp the implications of his words, but when Jacob reached across the table and took her hand with a grip that was both gentle and unyielding, the horror of what he was suggesting crashed over her like ice water. She tried to stand, to run, to scream, but Caleb's hand was already on her shoulder, pressing her back down into the chair, and Ezra was locking the door behind them. The Appalachian mountains have always held secrets in their folds, stories whispered in the dark about families who went too far into the wilderness and came back changed, about bloodlines that twisted in on themselves until something inhuman emerged. The Hollow family was about to become one of those stories, a tale that would haunt Harlan County for generations, a mystery that would only come to light when a brave postal worker noticed that Martha's mail had been piling up for weeks and decided to investigate. But that discovery was still months away, and on that November night, as the first snow began to fall on Blackwater Ridge, Martha Hollow faced a nightmare that no mother should ever have to endure, trapped in a cabin with the sons she had raised, who now saw her not as a parent, but as something else entirely. The days that followed blurred together for Martha in a haze of shock and disbelief. Jacob had moved her belongings into what had been the master bedroom, the room she had shared with her husband before his death, and he made it clear that this was now a shared space. The brothers took turns keeping watch, ensuring she never had a moment alone, never had an opportunity to escape or call for help. They spoke to her in calm, rational tones, as if what they were doing was perfectly natural, as if the entire world operated by the same twisted logic that had taken root in their minds. Jacob explained that he had been planning this for over a year, that he had read about families in the old days who kept their bloodlines pure, who understood that strength came from unity and isolation. Martha spent those first days in a state of numb compliance, her mind retreating to memories of better times, of her sons as children running through the fields, of her husband's laugh echoing through the cabin. She cooked their meals mechanically, washed their clothes, performed the domestic rituals that had defined her life, but inside she was screaming, searching desperately for a way out. The brothers had thought of everything. They had removed all the knives from the kitchen, except for one that Jacob kept on his belt. They had boarded up the windows in her bedroom. They had even taken the light bulbs from the lamps, leaving her in darkness at night, disoriented and afraid. Caleb was the one who showed the most hesitation. He was 31, the middle son, and had always been the gentlest of the three. Martha noticed the way he avoided her eyes, the way his hands shook when Jacob gave him orders. One afternoon, when they were alone for a brief moment, she grabbed his arm and begged him to help her, to remember who he used to be, to see the madness of what they were doing. For a second, she saw something flicker in his expression, a shadow of the boy who used to bring her wildflowers and read to her from the Bible. But then Jacob's footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Caleb pulled away, his face hardening into the same blank mask his brothers wore. Ezra, the youngest at 28, seemed to take a perverse pleasure in the situation. He was the one who had always been cruel to animals as a child, who had been expelled from school for fighting, who had spent 2 years in county jail for assault before coming back to the cabin. He watched Martha with a predatory intensity that made her skin crawl, and she knew that he was the most dangerous of the three, the one who would not hesitate if she tried to resist. Jacob was the architect of this nightmare, but Ezra was the enforcer, the one who enjoyed the power they now held over her. As winter deepened and the snow piled high around the cabin, Martha began to understand that no one was coming to save her. The brothers had isolated themselves so completely that the community had simply forgotten about them, written them off as another strange mountain family, best left alone. She lay awake at night listening to the wind howl through the trees and wondered how long she could survive this, how long her mind could hold together under the weight of what was being done to her. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and despair, a small flame of rage began to kindle, a determination that if she was going to die in this cabin, she would not die quietly. February brought a cold snap that froze the pipes and left the cabin without running water for nearly 2 weeks. The brothers had to haul buckets from the creek, breaking through the ice each morning, and the added labor made them irritable and short-tempered. Martha saw an opportunity in their distraction. She began to observe their routines more carefully, noting when each brother slept, when they left her alone for even a few minutes, when their attention wandered. She started hiding small items, a fork from dinner, a box of matches, a shard of broken glass from a jar that Ezra had dropped. She did not have a plan yet, but she was preparing, gathering tools for a moment that might never come. Jacob had begun to talk about the future, about how they would need to be careful, about how Martha would need to understand her role in preserving the family. He spoke of children, of continuing the hollow bloodline, and the words made Martha's blood run cold. She realized then that they intended this to go on indefinitely, that in their diseased minds they had constructed an entire reality, where this was acceptable, even necessary. She also realized that she was running out of time, that if she did not act soon, she might lose the will to act at all. One night in early March, Caleb came to her room alone. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, and for a long time he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he told her he was sorry, that he did not know how things had gotten so out of control, that he wished he could go back and change everything. Martha saw her chance. She spoke softly, carefully, telling him that it was not too late, that he could still help her, that they could go to the authorities together and explain that Jacob had forced him into this. She watched hope and fear war in his expression, watched him teeter on the edge of a decision that could save them both. But Jacob had been listening at the door. He burst into the room with a fury Martha had never seen before, grabbing Caleb by the throat and slamming him against the wall. He screamed that traitors were worse than outsiders, that family loyalty was everything, that Caleb had betrayed them all. Ezra appeared behind him, and together they dragged Caleb out of the room. Martha heard the sounds of violence from downstairs, heard Caleb crying out, heard the sickening thud of fists against flesh. When they finally brought him back up hours later, his face was swollen and bloody, and the light of rebellion had been beaten out of his eyes. After that night, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. Jacob watched everyone with suspicion, even Ezra. He began sleeping with a shotgun beside his bed. and he made new rules about who could be alone with Martha and for how long. The cabin felt like a pressure cooker, the tension building with each passing day, and Martha knew that something had to break soon. She continued to hide her small collection of potential weapons, continued to watch and wait, and she prayed to a God she was no longer sure was listening that she would find a way to survive this hell, or at least take her captors with her when she fell. April arrived with unseasonable warmth, melting the snow and turning the dirt road to the cabin into a river of mud. The thaw brought with it a visitor that none of them expected, Dale Morrison. The postal worker who had been delivering mail to Harlan County for 23 years noticed that the hollow mailbox had been overflowing for months. He had tried to deliver a certified letter twice and found no one home, which struck him as odd since the brothers never left the property. On a Tuesday morning, acting on instinct and a growing sense that something was wrong, Dale decided to drive up to the cabin and check on the family in person. Martha heard the truck engine laboring up the muddy road and felt her heart leap into her throat. She was in the kitchen with Ezra, who was cleaning his hunting rifle at the table. The moment he heard the vehicle, his head snapped up, and he moved to the window with the predatory quickness that always frightened her. Jacob appeared from the basement, his face dark with anger, and he grabbed Martha by the arm hard enough to bruise. He told her that if she made a single sound, if she tried to signal for help in any way, he would kill whoever was at the door and make her watch. She believed him. Dale knocked 3 times, calling out in his friendly voice that he had mail for the Hollow family and wanted to make sure everything was all right. Jacob opened the door just wide enough to show his face, blocking the view into the cabin with his body. He told Dale that everything was fine, that his mother had been ill but was recovering, that they appreciated his concern but did not need any help. Dale tried to peer past him, his instinct screaming that something was off, but Jacob was immovable. The 2 men stood there for a long moment, tension crackling between them, and then Dale made a decision that would change everything. He told Jacob that he needed Martha to sign for the certified letter personally, that it was the law and he could not leave without her signature. Jacob's jaw tightened, and for a second Dale thought the man might slam the door in his face or worse. But then Jacob stepped back and called for Martha, his voice dripping with false warmth. She appeared in the doorway, pale and thin, her eyes hollow, and Dale felt his stomach drop. This was not the vibrant woman he remembered from years past. This was someone who had been broken. Martha took the clipboard with shaking hands, and as she signed her name, she looked directly into Dale's eyes and mouthed 2 words. "Help me." Dale kept his expression neutral, thanked them for their time, and walked back to his truck with his heart pounding. He did not speed away, did not show any sign that he had seen Martha's desperate plea, but the moment he was out of sight of the cabin, he grabbed his radio and called the sheriff's office. He told them that he had reasonable suspicion that Martha Hollow was being held against her will, that the situation felt dangerous, and that they needed to send deputies immediately. The dispatcher tried to calm him down, to suggest that he might be overreacting, but Dale was insistent. He had seen enough in his years on the route to know when something was terribly wrong, and he was not going to let bureaucracy or doubt stop him from saving a woman's life. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw received the call at 2 in the afternoon and initially dismissed it as an overreaction from a well-meaning postal worker. The Hollow family had always been odd, but odd was not illegal, and he had more pressing matters to deal with in a county plagued by drug trafficking and domestic disputes. But Dale Morrison was persistent, calling back twice more within the hour, and finally Bradshaw agreed to send 2 deputies up to the cabin to conduct a welfare check. He told them to be cautious, to observe and report back, but not to escalate the situation unless they had clear evidence of a crime. It was a decision he would regret for the rest of his career. Deputies Angela Chen and Marcus Webb arrived at the Hollow cabin just before sunset. The place looked abandoned from the outside, the yard overgrown, the porch sagging, the windows dark. Chen, who had been with the department for 8 years and had a reputation for thoroughness, immediately felt uneasy. She radioed back to dispatch that they were approaching the residence and requested backup to stand by. Webb, younger and less experienced, thought she was being paranoid, but he followed her lead as they walked up to the front door. Chen knocked firmly, and identified herself as law enforcement, stating that they were there to check on Martha Hollow's welfare. The door opened slowly, and Jacob stood there with the same blank expression he had shown Dale Morrison. He told the deputies that his mother was resting, that she had been ill with pneumonia and that the doctor had advised bed rest. Chen asked if they could speak with Martha directly, and Jacob hesitated just long enough for Chen to know that something was very wrong. She placed her hand on her sidearm, not drawing it, but making her readiness clear, and repeated her request in a tone that left no room for negotiation. Jacob's eyes flickered with calculation, and then he stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. The inside of the cabin was dim and smelled of mildew and something else, something sour that Chen could not quite identify. Caleb and Ezra were sitting in the living room, both of them watching the deputies with expressions that ranged from fear to hostility. Chen asked Webb to stay with the brothers while she went upstairs to check on Martha. As she climbed the creaking stairs, her hand never left her weapon, and she felt the weight of unseen eyes following her every move. She found Martha in the master bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of exhaustion and terror. Chen knelt beside her and spoke softly, asking if she was being held against her will, if she was in danger, if she needed help. For a long moment, Martha said nothing, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting one of her sons to appear. Then, in a voice that was barely audible, she whispered, "Yes." She told Chen that her sons had been holding her prisoner for months, that they had done things to her that she could not speak aloud, that she was afraid they would kill her if she tried to leave. Chen felt rage and sorrow wash over her in equal measure. She radioed for immediate backup, called for an ambulance, and then she did something that probably saved both their lives. She drew her weapon, positioned herself between Martha and the door, and prepared for the Hollow brothers to make their move. The sound of Chen's radio crackling with the backup request sent a jolt of panic through the cabin. Jacob moved first, his hand reaching for the shotgun he kept beside the couch, but Webb was faster. The young deputy drew his weapon and ordered all three brothers to get on the ground, his voice cracking with adrenaline but his aim steady. Ezra lunged at him, and the two men crashed into the coffee table, sending a lamp shattering across the floor. Caleb froze, his hands raised, tears streaming down his face, while Jacob raised the shotgun and pointed it at the stairs where Chen and Martha were. Chen heard the commotion below and made a split-second decision. She grabbed Martha and pulled her into the small bathroom adjacent to the bedroom, locking the door and positioning the two of them in the bathtub, the only cover available. She could hear Jacob's heavy footsteps on the stairs, could hear him shouting that they had no right to interfere with his family, that they did not understand what was necessary to keep the bloodline pure. His words were the ravings of a madman, but the shotgun in his hands was very real. Chen radioed her position and situation, her voice calm despite the terror coursing through her veins, and she told dispatch that shots might be fired and they needed SWAT immediately. Jacob kicked open the bathroom door, the wood splintering under the force of his boot. He stood in the doorway, the shotgun leveled at Chen, and for a moment time seemed to stop. Chen had her service weapon trained on his chest, and she could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of options, the decision between surrender and violence. Behind him she could hear Webb struggling with Ezra, could hear Caleb sobbing and begging everyone to stop. Martha was pressed against Chen's side, trembling so violently that the deputy could feel it through her uniform. Chen spoke in the firm, authoritative voice she had been trained to use in crisis situations, telling Jacob to lower his weapon, to think about what he was doing, to understand that this could only end one way if he chose violence. For a heartbeat, it seemed like Jacob might comply. His finger eased off the trigger, and the barrel of the shotgun dipped slightly. But then Ezra's voice rang out from downstairs, screaming that he had Webb's gun, that he would kill the deputy if they did not let them go. Jacob's expression hardened, and Chen saw the decision crystallize in his eyes. She fired 3 times, center mass, the reports deafening in the small bathroom. Jacob staggered backward, the shotgun falling from his hands, and he collapsed in the hallway, blood spreading across the worn floorboards. Martha screamed, a sound of anguish and relief and horror all mixed together, and Chen moved past Jacob's body to the stairs, her weapon still raised, her training overriding the shock of having just taken a life. Downstairs, Ezra had indeed wrestled Webb's gun away and was holding it with shaking hands, pointing it wildly between Webb and Caleb. When he saw Chen appear at the top of the stairs, saw his brother's blood on her uniform, something broke inside him. He turned the gun toward Chen, and she fired again, twice, dropping him before he could pull the trigger. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Caleb's hysterical weeping and the distant sound of sirens finally approaching. Webb scrambled to his feet, retrieved his weapon, and secured Caleb, who offered no resistance, who seemed to have retreated entirely into himself. Chen went back to Martha, who was still in the bathtub, rocking back and forth, and she held the older woman while they waited for backup to arrive, for the nightmare to officially end. The aftermath of the shooting at the Hollow cabin dominated Harlan County news for weeks. Sheriff Bradshaw held a press conference where he praised Deputies Chen and Webb for their bravery and confirmed that Martha Hollow had been rescued from a situation of prolonged captivity and abuse. He was careful with his language, avoiding explicit details out of respect for Martha's privacy, but the rumors spread quickly through the small community. People whispered about what the brothers had done, about the depravity that had festered in that isolated cabin, about how no one had noticed or intervened sooner. The guilt was collective, a stain on the conscience of everyone who had seen the Hollow family withdraw from society and had simply looked the other way. Martha was taken to Harlan County Hospital, where she spent 2 weeks under observation. The doctors treated her for malnutrition, dehydration, and a host of psychological traumas that would take years to address. A victim advocate was assigned to her case, and slowly, painfully, Martha began to tell her story to investigators. The details were worse than anyone had imagined. The abuse had started gradually, with Jacob isolating her from friends and community, then escalated to physical confinement, and finally to the unspeakable acts that had defined the last months of her captivity. The district attorney considered charging Caleb as an accomplice, but Martha's testimony made it clear that he had been as much a victim of Jacob's domination as she had been, coerced and brutalized into compliance. Caleb Hollow was ultimately placed in a psychiatric facility for evaluation. The doctors diagnosed him with severe PTSD and a dissociative disorder brought on by years of abuse at the hands of his older brother. He would spend the next 3 years in treatment, slowly piecing together a sense of self that had been shattered by Jacob's tyranny. He never returned to Harlan County. When he was finally released, he moved to a group home in another state, changed his name, and tried to build a life far from the shadow of Blackwater Ridge. He sent Martha a letter once, years later, apologizing for his weakness, for not protecting her, for not being strong enough to stop what had happened. She never responded, but she kept the letter in a drawer, a reminder that even in the darkest situations, some people are victims of circumstances beyond their control. The cabin itself became a source of morbid fascination. Teenagers dared each other to hike up to Blackwater Ridge and peer through the boarded windows, looking for ghosts or evidence of the horrors that had occurred there. The county eventually seized the property for unpaid taxes and had the structure demolished in 1992. The land was sold to a developer who planned to build vacation homes, but the project never materialized. Local superstition held that the ground was cursed, that the evil that had taken root there had poisoned the soil itself. To this day, the lot remains empty, overgrown with weeds and brambles, a scar on the landscape that no one wants to touch. Martha Hollow moved to Tennessee to live with a cousin, far from the mountains that had been both her home and her prison. She never spoke publicly about what had happened to her, declining all interview requests from journalists and true crime writers who wanted to tell her story. She attended therapy regularly, joined a support group for survivors of familial abuse, and slowly rebuilt a life that had been stolen from her. She died in 2003 at the age of 68, and her obituary made no mention of the Hollow brothers or the cabin on Blackwater Ridge. Those who knew her in Tennessee remembered her as a kind, quiet woman who loved gardening and volunteered at the local library, a woman who had survived something terrible and had chosen to define herself by her resilience rather than her trauma. The case of the Hollow brothers forced Harlan County to confront uncomfortable questions about isolation, mental illness, and the responsibility of communities to watch out for their most vulnerable members. In the months following Martha's rescue, the county implemented new protocols for welfare checks, trained social workers to recognize signs of familial abuse, and established a hotline for reporting concerns about isolated or at-risk individuals. Sheriff Bradshaw, haunted by the knowledge that he had initially dismissed Dale Morrison's concerns, became a vocal advocate for taking every report seriously, no matter how unlikely it seemed. He retired in 1995, but his legacy was a department that prioritized prevention and intervention over reactive policing. Deputy Angela Chen received a commendation for her actions at the Hollow Cabin, but she struggled with the psychological aftermath of the shooting. Taking 2 lives, even in defense of herself and an innocent victim, left scars that no medal could heal. She worked with a police psychologist for over a year, processing the trauma and the complex emotions that came with having killed 2 men who were themselves products of a diseased family system. She eventually left law enforcement and became a counselor specializing in helping first responders deal with critical incidents. Her experience at the Hollow Cabin informed her work, giving her a deep understanding of the moral complexities and emotional toll of violence, even when that violence is justified. Marcus Webb, the younger deputy who had struggled with Ezra Hollow, also left the sheriff's department, but for different reasons. The incident shook his confidence and made him question whether he was suited for law enforcement. He moved to Lexington and became a teacher, working with at-risk youth and trying to intervene in troubled lives before they spiraled into the kind of darkness he had witnessed at Blackwater Ridge. He often thought about Caleb Hollow, about how different things might have been if someone had reached that young man before Jacob's influence had become absolute. Webb's classroom became a place where students felt safe to talk about their home lives, where warning signs were noticed and addressed, where the cycle of abuse could potentially be broken. Dale Morrison, the postal worker whose persistence had set the rescue in motion, became something of a local hero. People stopped him on the street to thank him, to tell him that his actions had restored their faith in the power of one person to make a difference. He remained humble about his role, insisting that he had simply done what anyone with a conscience would do, but privately, he was haunted by the question of how long Martha had been suffering before he finally acted. How many times he had driven past that mailbox and noticed it was full but had not followed his instincts. He retired in 1995 and spent his remaining years volunteering with organizations that helped victims of domestic violence, trying to atone for the months he had not acted sooner. The story of the Hollow brothers became a cautionary tale told throughout Appalachia, a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with fanfare and drama. Sometimes it grows quietly in isolated places, fed by mental illness, toxic family dynamics, and the willful blindness of communities that prefer not to see what is happening in their midst. The case was studied in criminal justice programs, analyzed in psychology journals, and referenced in training materials for social workers and law enforcement. But for those who lived through it, for Martha and the deputies and the postal worker and the community of Harlan County, it was not an academic exercise. It was a wound that never fully healed, a darkness that could not be entirely dispelled, a reminder that monsters are not always strangers lurking in shadows, but sometimes the people we think we know, living in houses we pass every day. In the years that followed, researchers and criminologists attempted to understand what had driven Jacob Hollow to orchestrate such a horrific situation. Interviews with extended family members revealed a history of mental illness on his father's side, including a grandfather who had been institutionalized for paranoid delusions. Jacob himself had shown signs of disturbance from a young age, torturing animals and exhibiting controlling behavior toward his younger brothers. After his father's death, with no authority figure to check his impulses, those tendencies had metastasized into something monstrous. Experts theorized that he had constructed an elaborate delusional system in which his actions were not only justified, but necessary, a twisted logic that allowed him to commit atrocities without remorse. The question of why no one intervened sooner haunted the community. In retrospect, there had been warning signs: Martha's sudden absence from church and social functions, the brothers' increasing hostility toward visitors, the deteriorating condition of the property. But in a culture that valued privacy and self-reliance, that viewed interference in family matters as inappropriate, those signs had been rationalized away. People told themselves that the Hollows were just private, just grieving, just going through a hard time. It was easier to look away than to confront the possibility that something truly evil was happening. The case became a catalyst for conversations about when concern becomes obligation, about the balance between respecting autonomy and protecting the vulnerable. Martha's story also sparked discussions about the unique vulnerabilities of women in isolated rural areas, where help can be hours away, and where traditional gender roles can trap women in situations of abuse and control. Advocacy groups used her case to push for better resources for rural domestic violence victims, for more funding for outreach programs, for legal reforms that would make it easier for victims to escape and seek protection. The Hollow case became a rallying cry, a stark illustration of what can happen when isolation, patriarchal family structures, and mental illness converge without intervention. For the people of Harlan County, the cabin on Blackwater Ridge became a symbol of collective failure and a reminder of the importance of community vigilance. The empty lot where it once stood was eventually turned into a small memorial park, not to commemorate the Hollow brothers, but to honor Martha and all victims of familial abuse. A simple stone marker was placed there with an inscription that read, "To those who suffer in silence, may we learn to listen, may we learn to see, may we learn to act." It was a promise and a prayer, a commitment that the community would not look away again, that the lessons learned from Martha Hollow's nightmare would not be forgotten. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil itself. Were the Hollow brothers born monsters, or were they made by circumstances, by mental illness, by the toxic dynamics of a family that had lost its moral center? Psychologists debated whether Jacob could have been helped if he had received intervention earlier, whether Caleb and Ezra were victims or perpetrators or both. There were no easy answers, only the recognition that human behavior exists on a spectrum of complexity that defies simple categorization. What was clear was that Martha had been an innocent victim, that her suffering had been real and profound, and that the failure to protect her was a stain on everyone who had the power to act, but chose not to. The legacy of the Hollow brothers extends beyond the immediate horror of their crimes to the broader lessons about family, community, and the responsibility we bear for one another. In the decades since Martha's rescue, her story has been told and retold, each iteration stripping away more of the sensationalism to reveal the human tragedy at its core. She was a woman who loved her sons, who had raised them with care and devotion, only to have that love twisted into a weapon used against her. Her survival was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the refusal to be entirely broken, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The case also highlighted the critical role of ordinary people in preventing and stopping abuse. Dale Morrison was not a trained investigator or a social worker. He was a postal worker who paid attention, who trusted his instincts, who refused to accept easy explanations when something felt wrong. His actions saved Martha's life and brought justice to a situation that might otherwise have remained hidden until it was too late. In a world that often feels overwhelming, where problems seem too big for individual action to matter, the story of Dale Morrison is a reminder that one person's courage and persistence can change everything. Deputy Angela Chen's decision to position herself between Martha and danger, to risk her own life to protect a woman she had never met, exemplified the best of what law enforcement can be. Her willingness to use lethal force when necessary, and her subsequent struggle with the moral weight of that decision, showed the complexity of violence even when it is justified. She became a symbol of the difficult choices that officers face and the psychological cost of those choices, a humanizing counterpoint to the often simplistic narratives about police use of force. For Harlan County, the Hollow case was a turning point, a moment when the community had to look in the mirror and confront its own complicity in allowing such a situation to develop. The changes implemented in the wake of Martha's rescue, the new protocols and training and awareness, were attempts to ensure that no one else would suffer as she had. But the real change was cultural, a shift away from the idea that what happens behind closed doors is no one else's business toward a recognition that we are all responsible for the welfare of our neighbors, especially the most vulnerable among us. The story of the Hollow brothers is not an easy one to hear. It challenges our assumptions about family, about the sanctity of the home, about the limits of privacy and autonomy. It forces us to confront the reality that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from strangers, but from those closest to us, and that evil can flourish in the silence of communities that choose not to see. But it is also a story of survival, of courage, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to protect the innocent. Martha Hollow endured a nightmare that would have destroyed many people, and she emerged on the other side to build a new life defined by her strength rather than her suffering. Her story, and the lessons it teaches, remain relevant today. A reminder that vigilance, compassion, and the willingness to act can make the difference between tragedy and rescue, between darkness and light.